Beef is expensive again, and the reason reaches beyond the meat case. For households, the effect is immediate. Beef is a regular grocery item, whether it is ground beef for a weekday meal, a roast for a family dinner, or steaks bought less often because the price has become harder to justify. When beef rises faster than the rest of the grocery bill, the pressure shows up in weekly shopping decisions. The increase does not begin at the supermarket. It begins earlier, with the size of the cattle herd. The number of beef cows available for breeding, the number of calves entering the system, the cost of cattle paid by processors, and the amount of beef available to move through wholesalers and retailers. The chain is clear. A smaller cattle herd creates tighter cattle supplies. Tighter supplies push farm-level cattle prices higher. Higher cattle costs pressure meatpackers and wholesalers. Retail beef prices rise. Households face higher prices at the grocery store. A family does not need to follow cattle inventories to feel the result. The final signal appears in the meat section, on the package label, and on the grocery receipt. The latest consumer price data shows how visible that pressure has become. In April 2026, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that beef and veal prices were up 14.8% over 12 months and rose 2.7% in April alone. Uncooked ground beef rose 14.5% over 12 months. Uncooked beef roasts rose 17.8%. Uncooked beefsteaks rose 16.1%. Those numbers stand out because the broader grocery increase was much lower. Food at home rose 2.9% over 12 months. The overall food index rose 3.2%. Beef was not simply moving with the grocery basket. It was rising much faster. Ground beef, roasts, and steaks are not abstract inflation categories. They are common items people compare, substitute, reduce, or skip when prices move sharply. A higher beef price can change what goes into the cart before the shopper reaches checkout. The warning from the industry was direct. On May 13, 2026, Reuters reported comments from Tyson Foods' chief financial officer Kurt Callaway at a BMO investor conference in New York. Callaway said heifer retention was spotty and regional. He also said, "We'll still manage in a tight cattle supply. Rebuilding the cattle herd depends on retaining heifers for breeding." Reuters explained that ranchers need to keep female cattle known as heifers in order to rebuild herds and increase beef production. If heifer retention is only spotty and regional, the supply problem does not disappear quickly. The cattle system cannot rebuild overnight. Future beef supply depends on decisions ranchers make before the meat reaches a processor, a wholesaler, a store, or a household refrigerator. Slow herd rebuilding keeps cattle supply tight. Tight cattle supply keeps beef expensive relative to other grocery items. The effect reaches households through the meat case. Reuters also reported that cattle supplies had dropped to a 75-year low in 2026. That gives the price increase a deeper context. Beef prices are not rising only because of one company, one store, or one short-term pricing decision. The supply base itself is historically tight. USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service reported that all cattle and calves in the United States totaled 86.2 million head as of January 1, 2026. 1 year earlier, the total was 86.5 million head. Beef cows totaled 27.6 million head, down 1% from a year earlier. The calf crop also pointed to pressure ahead. USDA estimated the 2025 calf crop at 32.9 million head, down 2% from the previous year. Cattle on feed totaled 13.8 million head as of January 1, 2026, down 3% from January 1, 2025. The pattern is consistent. The herd was smaller, beef cows were down, the calf crop was down, cattle on feed were down. Reuters described cattle supplies as a 75-year low. USDA described the situation as a cyclical contraction of the cattle herd that had resulted in tight cattle supplies and higher farm-level cattle prices. Fewer cattle create less supply flexibility. Less supply flexibility raises the cost of cattle. Higher cattle costs move through the beef system. Consumers see higher prices at the store. That does not mean every part of the system benefits. The research shows that some companies can be squeezed at the same time households are paying more. USDA reported that farm-level cattle prices were 16.2% higher in March 2026 than in March 2025. Wholesale beef prices were 19.7% higher over the same period. The pressure was not only at retail. It was moving through the upstream system before consumers saw the final beef price. Farm-level cattle prices rose. Wholesale beef prices rose. Retail beef prices rose. Each step pushed the pressure closer to the household. For ranchers, higher cattle prices can be a business opportunity. For meatpackers, higher cattle costs can compress margins. For consumers, the result can still be a more expensive package of beef. Reuters reported that meatpackers have lost money in beef businesses because soaring cattle costs outpaced gains from higher beef prices. Reuters also reported that Tyson closed a beef plant in Nebraska and reduced operations at a Texas facility, laying off thousands of workers. This expands the story from grocery prices into local economic consequences. The company is not the central character. The impact is: a meatpacking plant closes or reduces operations. Workers lose jobs. Local communities lose payroll and economic activity. At the same time, households continue to pay higher beef prices because the underlying cattle supply remains tight. Tyson closed a beef plant in Nebraska and reduced operations at a Texas facility. Beef processing capacity and employment were affected while meatpackers faced pressure from high cattle costs. Workers and local communities faced job losses, while consumers still faced expensive beef at the grocery store. High retail beef prices do not automatically mean every business in the chain is benefiting. When cattle costs rise faster than beef price gains, processors can be under pressure even as shoppers pay more. Consumers may look at the meat case and assume someone in the middle is simply charging more. The verified research shows a more complicated chain. Cattle supplies are tight, farm-level cattle prices are higher, wholesale beef prices are higher, meatpackers face higher input costs, retail prices rise, workers can still be affected by closures and reduced operations. The cost pressure moves in more than one direction. It moves downstream to consumers through higher prices. It moves sideways to processors through margin pressure. It moves into local economies when plants close or reduce operations. For middle-class households, the visible result is a higher grocery bill. For workers in affected facilities, the result can be a direct job shock. For the broader food system, the result is reduced stability in one of the most visible protein categories. The cattle herd explains why beef is different from other grocery items. BLS reported that chicken prices were down 0.7% over 12 months and down 1.1% in April 2026. Egg prices were down 39.2% over 12 months. Although they rose 1.5% in April, beef and veal were up 14.8% over 12 months. That contrast matters. Not all proteins were moving the same way. The story is not that every meat category was rising like beef. Beef had its own supply problem, its own production cycle, and its own pressure on prices. For households, that creates substitution choices. A family may buy chicken instead of beef. It may buy less ground beef. It may avoid roasts or steaks. It may stretch meals differently. The data does not say every household responds the same way. But when one common protein rises far faster than the broader grocery basket, shoppers face choices. Beef is not only another food item, it is a category where supply takes time to rebuild. That is why heifer retention is so important. USDA NAS reported 4.71 million beef replacement heifers as of January 1, 2026. Up 1% from a year earlier. Reuters still reported that heifer retention was spotty and regional. The cautious reading is that some replacement heifer numbers were up, but the rebuilding effort was not broad enough to remove the supply warning. The cattle cycle remained tight. Reuters reported that ranchers had been slow to retain heifers for breeding. The article said ranchers had been sending animals to slaughter to take advantage of high prices and because of worries about dry weather limiting grazing land. This connects market prices to ranch decisions. High cattle prices can encourage ranchers to sell animals. Dry weather can make grazing land less dependable. If ranchers do not retain enough heifers, the future breeding base remains limited. If the breeding base remains limited, beef supply stays tight. If beef supply stays tight, consumers continue to face higher prices. Dry weather is part of the pressure. Reuters reported that beef prices climbed because of strong demand as ranchers cut herds when drought hit grazing land in the western United States. AP also reported dry weather in the western U.S. Among the factors pushing beef prices higher, the connection is practical. Cattle need grazing land. When grazing conditions are strained, ranchers may reduce herds or avoid rebuilding. That reduces supply flexibility. Reduced supply flexibility supports higher prices. This is not a sudden event that appears only at checkout. It begins on ranch land, moves into cattle inventories, then into slaughter supply, wholesale markets, retail pricing, and household budgets. The price data shows the escalation. The 2025 calf crop was estimated at 32.9 million head, down 2% from the previous year. On January 1, 2026, the U.S. cattle and calves inventory was 86.2 million head, slightly below 86.5 million a year earlier. Beef cows totaled 27.6 million head, down 1%. Cattle on feed totaled 13.8 million head, down 3%. In March 2026, USDA reported farm-level cattle prices were 16.2% higher than March 2025. Wholesale beef prices were 19.7% higher. In April 2026, BLS reported beef and veal prices were 14.8% higher over 12 months. Ground beef rose 14.5%. Roasts rose 17.8%. Steaks rose 16.1%. Also in April 2026, USDA forecast 2026 beef production at 25.790 billion pounds, down 20 million pounds from the previous month's forecasts. USDA forecasts beef imports at 5.790 billion pounds, up 6% from 2025. On May 13, 2026, Reuters reported that Tyson's CFO said herd rebuilding was spotty and that cattle supplies would remain tight. This timeline shows a pattern, not an isolated price jump. Supply was tight at the herd level. Calf numbers were down. Cattle on feed were down. Farm-level cattle prices rose. Wholesale beef prices rose. Retail beef prices rose. Industry executives continued warning that supply would remain tight. That is how a cattle shortage becomes a household cost problem. Imports are part of the current picture, but they do not erase the domestic herd problem. USDA forecast beef imports at 5.790 billion pounds in 2026, up 6% from 2025. That suggests imports may help fill part of the supply gap. The same USDA's outlook forecasts lower domestic beef production at 25.790 billion pounds. Imports can help supplement supply, but they do not make the domestic cattle contraction disappear. For consumers, the price of beef is shaped by the entire supply picture: domestic production, cattle prices, wholesale prices, imports, demand, and processing costs. Reuters also reported that the U.S. administration had halted imports of Mexican cattle to keep out the New World screwworm parasite, adding to supply strain. The relevant economic point is that restrictions on cattle imports can add strain when domestic supplies are already tight. Imports of Mexican cattle were halted to keep out the New World screwworm parasite. An additional supply channel faced disruption. A tighter cattle market can increase pressure on beef prices paid by consumers. Demand also matters. Reuters reported beef prices climbed due to strong demand as ranchers cut herds. Because drought hit grazing land in the western United States. Supply alone is not the full picture. When supply is tight and demand remains strong, prices face upward pressure. If consumers continue buying beef while cattle supplies are limited, the market does not receive much price relief. For households, strong demand can create a difficult situation. A popular food remains expensive because there is not enough supply flexibility to bring prices down quickly. That is why retail beef can rise faster than the overall grocery basket. Beef and veal rose 14.8% over 12 months. Food at home rose 2.9%. Chicken was down 0.7%. Eggs were down 39.2%. Those differences show that inflation at the grocery store is not one uniform experience. A household buying more chicken and eggs may feel different pressure than a household buying more beef. A family that relies on ground beef for regular meals may notice the increase more sharply than one that rarely buys it. The data does not say all households are affected equally. It shows that beef is one of the categories carrying much heavier pressure. The cuts tell the same story. Ground beef rose 14.5% over 12 months. Beef roasts rose 17.8%. Beef steaks rose 16.1%. Ground beef is a common household item. Roasts and steaks may be bought less often, but they remain part of the meat case that consumers compare. Higher prices change behavior. They can lead to substitution, smaller purchases, fewer beef-based meals, or a larger grocery bill. The research does not prove which choice every household makes. It shows the pressure that creates those choices. The meatpacker side adds another layer. Tyson Foods is not the main character in the household story, but the company's actions show the pressure moving through the industry. Reuters reported Tyson closed a beef plant in Nebraska and reduced operations at a Texas facility, laying off thousands of workers because soaring cattle costs had outpaced gains from higher beef prices. The chain is clear: cattle costs rise. Meatpacking margins come under pressure. A company closes or reduces operations. Workers lose jobs. Local economies feel strain. Consumers still face higher beef prices because the upstream supply problem remains. This is the type of economic consequence that can be missed if the story focuses only on the shelf price. A high price at the grocery store can coexist with stress inside the supply chain. The worker losing a job and the shopper paying more are both affected by the same underlying pressure. The cost shock does not land in one place. It spreads across the beef system. It lands on ranchers making herd decisions. It lands on meatpackers paying more for cattle. It lands on workers at affected facilities. It lands on retailers trying to price beef. It lands on households comparing meat prices. The same supply problem creates different consequences at each step. As of May 18, 2026, the latest BLS CPI data available in this research showed beef and veal prices up 14.8% over 12 months and 2.7% in April alone. Ground beef was up 14.5%. Beef roasts were up 17.8%. Beef steaks were up 16.1%. The latest USDA NAS annual cattle inventory report showed the U.S. cattle herd at 86.2 million head as of January 1, 2026, with 27.6 million beef cows, down 1% from a year earlier. USDA ERS reported tight cattle supplies and higher farm-level cattle prices, with farm-level cattle prices 16.2% higher in March 2026 than in March 2025. Wholesale beef prices were 19.7% higher over the same period. USDA ERS forecasts 2026 beef production at 25.790 billion pounds, down 20 million pounds from the previous month's forecast. Beef imports were forecast at 5.790 billion pounds, up 6% from 2025. Reuters reported that Kurt Colloway said cattle supplies would remain tight through 2026 and into 2027, and that heifer retention was spotty and regional. Together, those facts describe a beef market under strain. The herd is historically tight. Beef cows are down. The calf crop is down. Cattle on feed is down. Cattle prices are higher. Wholesale beef is higher. Retail beef is higher. Some processors are under pressure. Some workers have been affected by plant closures or reduced operations. Households continue to see the consequences in the grocery store. The unresolved pressure is supply. Beef production cannot increase instantly when the herd is small. Rebuilding requires retaining heifers. Retaining heifers depends on ranch decisions, prices, grazing conditions, and confidence that conditions support expansion. Reuters reported that the rebuilding effort remains spotty and regional. That is why the beef price problem is difficult for households. It is not simply a weekly promotion issue. It is not only a grocery store issue. It is not just one company's decision. It is a supply cycle issue moving through the food system. When the cattle herd contracts, the pressure moves downstream. When cattle supplies tighten, processors pay more. When wholesale prices rise, retailers face higher costs. When retail beef prices rise, households adjust their grocery choices. When plants close or reduce operations, workers and local communities feel the consequences. This is how a cattle supply problem becomes a middle-class budget problem. The final price on a package of beef is not just a store decision. It reflects ranch conditions, herd size, cattle prices, processing pressure, wholesale markets, imports, demand, and retail pricing. Beef is expensive again because the story begins with a smaller cattle herd, moves through tight supplies and higher cattle costs, reaches meatpackers and workers, and ends where most people see it, in the grocery cart.